As you may know, construction has one of the largest impacts on the environment. Concrete, just the sheer construction, the amount of construction that is going to happen across the world. And we're going to hear from Karen Scrivener, who is a world-leading expert. She's a scientist. She has been professor at EPFL for, I believe, over 20 years. She has also recently launched a center for, and I don't want to butcher it, the Worldwide Sustainable Construction Center. And what I found remarkable since I've known Karen is that not only is she a highly decorated scientist, but she also really cares about the real world, right? She cares about how things translate in the real world, what kind of impact her work can have. So she likes to go outside of the lab, and for that we're very fortunate to have her join us today. And as always, you can join the conversation. Karen, please join me. The floor is yours.
Okay. So thank you very much for the introduction. I think I don't need to say anything more about the problems that are facing us. I think it's obvious we're in deep shit, that 2/3 of us should just go out and shoot ourselves. But I think we have to be a little bit more optimistic than that. So I'm going to talk about realistic strategies for decarbonizing construction. In the introduction, we said, okay, it's a large impact construction, roughly 40% of CO2 emissions. And that's divided roughly half and half between the energy component of everything we do in a building, the heating, the cooling, the cooking, and the materials. And my expertise is on the materials. So let's start by looking at the materials we use. And yes, I work on concrete. A lot of people have a very negative view of concrete. They say, oh gosh, this is responsible for 8% of CO2 emissions. Yes, it is. But look at the amount we use. More than 3/4 of all the materials we use are based on cement. So purely from a resource point of view, there's no way we can replace it with something else. And in fact, when we look here at the right column, which is the CO2 emissions, you see in proportion to the amount used, the CO2 emissions coming from cement-based materials are relatively low. In proportion, they're much lower than steel, much lower than asphalt, much lower than brick. So we're not going to solve our problems by trying to replace concrete with any of those. People may say, oh, well, wood could solve the problem, but we've got this global land squeeze. We simply can't produce enough wood. So what we've got to do, we've got to make the concrete better, perform well, do more with less. And to do that, we have to understand how we get here. We have to understand that this material we use for 3/4 of all the materials we make is coming from the earth. We produce 4 billion tons every year. And it's an inevitable consequence of the chemistry and geology of the earth. This is the chemistry of the earth. This is the composition of the earth's crust. It's remarkable that just 8 elements are making up more than 98% of the earth. So we're already hearing all these problems of getting hold of rare metals, everything like that. Clearly, we're not going to use those to produce cement. So we have to accept this is the chemical system we're in. And if we then understand the chemistry, this actually takes us down to the system at the bottom of just 3 oxides of calcium, silicon, and aluminium, where we can make cement, but also all construction materials. And then we have to understand geology. Now, I don't know about you, but I mean, geology always seemed incredibly too complicated for me. I could never really get to grips with it until one of my postdocs showed me this slide, and I realized it's actually very simple. We have volcanoes. Volcanoes produce rocks. Those rocks, on average, have the average composition of the Earth, like I just showed you. And then we have the weathering processes, and that's where it gets complicated, because during weathering, these rocks break down under the action of wind and rain, etc., and all the calcium component actually is picking up CO2 from the atmosphere. This is the process that's going on now. This rock weathering is actually responsible for taking a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere all the time. And the consequence of that is we form limestone. And when it comes to producing cement, that limestone's very useful. We can see here are the major limestone deposits in the world. And in Europe, we have the good fortune, or we have, because it's still there, the good fortune that the limestone deposits are quite mixed up with all the other stuff. And this means that it was really no surprise that 200 years ago, people learned to put these materials together in the right proportions to make cement. But unfortunately, the downside is that then this limestone, which picked up all the CO2 during its formation, is giving back the CO2 to the atmosphere. And as we know, we have to do something fast about that. Now, here in Switzerland, some people say, we just stop building. Well, we may be able to do that in Switzerland. We may have enough buildings already, but let's face it, Swiss population is 0.1% of the world population, and construction is going to continue above all in the global north. These are the projected increases in floor area, and you see where it's all going to be happening is the global south, and notably Africa. And to put that in proportion, bear in mind that the population of India today, you see the relatively small size of India, is more than the population of the whole of Africa. So it's not like Africa is very overpopulated. And to do that, people are going to need cement. Let's see how the use of cement has changed in my lifetime. I was 2 years old in 1960, and you can actually see that black part at the bottom, the consumption in the global north, has really hardly changed, even though the population has doubled. So actually here in Europe, we're using way less concrete than we were back in 1960. What's completely changed the equation, of course, has been the growth in China, where now we have more than half the cement consumption. And that's because China developed very fast. It actually took a lot of people out of poverty, but now that consumption in China is going down. And you'll see that overall, the projections are not for an increase in demand, but a shift in where we need this cement. Now, you may have read in the press about all these exotic solutions. I'm not going to go into those. It would take me about an hour, but only an hour, to explain to you that they're actually all complete nonsense, okay? They either would cost about 40 times as much, we haven't got the materials, etc., etc. That sounds very negative, but there are, on the contrary, a lot of things we can do, and we can do today. But we have to realize we have to work at all the different stages of the production process. We have to work, first of all, on efficiently producing the first material, which is called clinker, then using less of that clinker in cement, then using less of that cement in concrete, etc., building our buildings more efficiently, not over-designing. And in fact, most of those solutions, which can take us to about 80% of the reduction, can be done at very low or even negative cost. So what we have to do is to find the ways to implement these. This won't take us totally to zero. We'll have a gap of about 20%. That's where people talk about carbon capture and storage. But what I want you to understand is we have got these solutions which can give us this massive reduction by 2050, even by 2030, for comparatively low cost. And it's much more important to invest in these than some illusion of a carbon negative material, which I actually don't think exists, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt and pretend it does. By some miracle, this could increase a little bit, but it would be extremely expensive. So where do you want to invest, on the left or the right? And this is what we're doing. The most promising approach is to replace the clinker with other materials. We've been doing this for years. We've been using materials which are called slag, which comes from producing steel, and fly ash that comes from burning coal. Of course, burning coal is the very first thing we have to stop to reduce CO2. So that's where we realized that the only alternative was to use what's called calcined clay. That's basically just clay that's heated up. And by reacting that with limestone, we could go to very high levels of substitution with the same or even better performance. And the raw materials we use are super abundant everywhere around the world, especially where in these developing countries. So this is not just a nice idea in the lab. This is really in practice. The first factory doing this came online in Colombia about 6 years ago. They're using this in full-scale constructions. This is the biggest plant in the world to date in Ghana. And we even have production in Switzerland. This building going up just down the road, the Telia Tower, I visited the other day. This is all being constructed with this LC3 cement. So today we have about 15 plants which are producing this, but we need to go much further because we're really just at the tip of the iceberg. We have an installed capacity of about 15 million tons, but we need to go to about 800. And that potential can be done at lower cost and can potentially save about 800 million tons of CO2 per year. So I don't want to talk more about the technical solutions, but I want to come back to the fact that we have to work at all these different stages. And that's why we've put together the Center for Worldwide Sustainable Construction to try and cover the whole value chain, to bring together the engineers, the architects, the constructors towards a more sustainable environment. We're having many government delegations coming to our summit next year in April. I hope some of you may join us. And, I want to show that we've recently published a paper to show that under a business-as-usual scenario, most developing countries are on the left of what is called this cement hump. As countries develop, we have GDP per capita along the bottom. And under a business-as-usual scenario, their emissions would increase. But if we apply just 3 available technologies of better design, calcined clay, and better concrete, we can turn most of those orange lines green, which means even though GDP is increasing, the CO2 emissions are going down. So that's just summarized here. I hope you've given you a little bit of optimism that in some areas we can improve things. It's a tiny, tiny part of the solution, but we need to start somewhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Maybe just one question before I let go to the next panel is, when we talk about new technologies, we think about bottlenecks, right, or choke points. Right now, in your experience, where is the barrier? What is the most binding barrier moving forward to you?
I hate to say it, it's actually, in a lot of places, overcapacity. Too many plants have already been built, like in China. We're going to have to shut down 2/3 of the plant. That's a tremendous social upheaval, you can imagine. And that's one of the biggest barriers. But it's also why we're focusing on Africa as the place where we haven't got this bottleneck, where we can most quickly bring solutions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.